This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 176 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Today I'm speaking with David Tyson. David served in the U.S. Army, first as an enlisted artilleryman and later as an intelligence officer. During his time in the Army, he discovered he had an affinity for learning languages, and after leaving the service, he began working towards a graduate degree, focusing his studies on Central Asia. He was recruited by the Central Intelligence Agency in 1996, and 5 years later was one of the first Americans to enter Afghanistan in November 2001. David and the other members of his team worked side by side with members of the Northern Alliance as they fought their way through the country, culminating in the retaking of Kabul and a decisive battlefield victory over the Taliban within just a few weeks. Along the way, the team found themselves in serious danger, including the terrible and costly fight during the Qali-i Jangi prison uprising, which cost the life of Mike Spann, America's first casualty in Afghanistan. I invited David onto the podcast to discuss the path that took him to Afghanistan in November 2001 and the role he played in the earliest days of the global war on terror. But before we dive into David's story, I want to say a big thank you to everyone listening who is also supporting me on Patreon, including Dylan L. and Eric G. Your monthly contributions there help me keep this podcast going week in and week out. As a way of thanking my patrons, I offer a lot of great freebies and promotions, including free and discounted books and products from the Spycraft 101 store. Patrons also get exclusive access to long-form articles of mine that aren't available anywhere else. If you haven't signed up for my Patreon yet, but you want to, just click the link in the show notes on whatever podcast platform you're listening to. David, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I read about you in Toby Harnden's book, First Casualty, back in 2021 when it first debuted, but I never thought that I'd have the chance to speak to you in person about the events that are described in that book. So I'm very grateful for that opportunity.
Well, great. Thank you.
So what was it that made you decide to open up about those experiences that you had in Afghanistan and earlier, specifically to Toby and to others? What made you go public about all of that ultimately?
Well, I guess the first thing and most important thing was I was permitted by the agency. You know, a number of years had passed, obviously, since 2001. So there was sort of a time element there that we observed. And after that, we were allowed to talk. And it was initially something, you're kind of reluctant to talk about things, but there's other reasons why that I felt sort of compelled or interested in talking. I wanted to get the story out about our team, about the agency, about the Afghans. More importantly, I guess, was to get the story out about Mike Spann and what he did and what his sacrifice was all about.
Mm-hmm. Very understandable, yeah. How did you first get linked up with Toby? Was that because he found you, or did he go through the agency or something like that?
Toby found me. I forget exactly how. It's not that hard to find people, obviously, these days, and I'm not I wasn't hiding at the time. So he just found me and called me. And after I got the okay from the agency to talk to him, that's when we started in earnest. He did contact me prior to that, a couple of years before. And at the time I declined to talk to him. But
Okay.
The second time was a charm.
I see. That actually gives me hope because a lot of people have declined to talk to me as well over the past few years. So maybe I should reach out again eventually for some of those. Toby is a great guy in my opinion. We linked up when I first interviewed him about his book, but we've stayed in very constant contact since then. And I interviewed him about his book Bandit Country later on as well, and met a couple of times in person. And he's just a great guy and a phenomenal researcher as well, in my opinion.
Yeah, obviously that played a big role in my willingness to talk to him, and it played a big role in our other team members' willingness to talk to him as well, because Toby's sort of skill as an author and as a researcher, and just being a good guy. He wanted
absolutely.
to do the good things.
Totally agree. So going back to you, David, can you tell me a little bit about like your early life and what led you to join the Army to begin with, that sort of thing?
Well, I was born in Pennsylvania, sort of in a small town outside of Philadelphia, in between Philadelphia and Amish country in Pennsylvania. And I really had no awareness of the agency as a young person. My dad worked in a paper mill, and I was sort of destined for the life of that small town, working in mills and factories or, stuff like that. And that's what I thought about as I got older. I was into sports. I was into especially basketball, and I really enjoyed playing basketball and made a lot of good friends. And it gave me things to think about. And I thought about an outside, a world outside of my small town, partly thanks to playing basketball. And obviously, that dream of being a basketball player didn't last that long, but it allowed me to sort of think outside of my town. And as I got older into my teenage years, I understood that I wanted to sort of get out of town and see what the world was about. And there wasn't a whole lot, at least in my mind, and sort of where we grew up, about how to do that. And one of the main ways was either to play sports and become a star and get out of town that way, and that wasn't going to happen. It didn't happen. And the other way was sort of join the military. From a fairly early age, I thought about the military, especially the Army, and as soon as I got out of high school, a couple days later, I was in the Army.
Wow.
And that started this sort of process. Being a field artilleryman, you're not on the cutting edge of intellectual prowess in the military. So it was I learned a great deal. I had a great upbringing as a kid, great parents, great friends, playing sports. So the military wasn't a big shock to me, but it did instill a sense of discipline, sense of hard work. And there were, at the time, and this is in 1979, so this is an old Army. This is right after Vietnam, so to speak. And the, the folks the guys that were in the military then weren't, most of us didn't have a lot of choices in life. Let's put it that way. So I got to deal with a lot more people that, again, from my town, that same sort of cohort of people, working class. Some of these kids had tough lives. And I really, in hindsight, especially, I look back in the Army days and thought, what a great lesson. What a great sort of way to become a young adult. A lot of pitfalls, obviously, in the teenage years. And my upbringing and being in the Army, I think I avoided a lot of stuff that a lot of kids fell into that is not good. But I really, again, in hindsight, I enjoyed the Army. I learned a great deal, the hardships and everything, learning how to just do things and get them done, not crying, not just coming up that sort of school of hard knocks and being an enlisted person, especially in field artillery. It's not the cutting edge of science and technology and all that stuff. Just a lot of hard work and living in the mud and in the cold weather. I went to Germany and so forth. So at the time, of course, I didn't enjoy it. I thought I wanted out, but I spent my years there, got out. And then after getting out, you go back to the same hometown again. And my dad was still in the mills. He was getting older, and I had worked in those kind of jobs before the Army. And then when I got out of the Army, I came back and sort of, well, things hadn't really changed, but I had changed a great deal. I wanted so much more, and I went back into the mill for a very short time. And man, I knew that this was not it. This was not for me. And after a little bit of other kind of jobs, really hard jobs that, a lot of people do, and I respect that. But for me, man, it was just not what I wanted. And I decided out of the blue, so to speak, to go to college. And our family, we didn't have much of that in our background. And that was never really a choice or even a thought for us. I just said, oh, I'll just go to college. Right. And, I had some, the version of the GI Bill I had at my, access to that. But obviously getting into college was a little more difficult. You just don't walk up. You have to take tests. There's the SATs and stuff like that. I had never done any of that before. So here I am, a young man, just trying to get into college. They look at transcripts, and my transcripts from high school weren't that great. In fact, they're kind of poor. So I finally got in on some kind of waiver for veterans, and I had to take 000 classes, which were the basic classes that, kids like myself had to take. They were just basically high school classes again for no credit. And I took a bunch of those, and finally I got on a program where, if you screw up, you're kicked out, but if you do okay, they're going to accept you and you can be a full-time student. That's what I did. And I studied my butt off in college, and I loved it from the very first. I didn't mess around. I didn't drink, didn't party. I was in school all the time or studying, man.
Hmm.
And I really, and I was on work study programs the state gave us, and this is in Pennsylvania, Westchester State College at the time. And just, it opened a whole new world for me. This idea of learning stuff, learning about the world, learning about philosophy, even math. And, it was just like, where had I been all my life? I had no real clue as a high schooler what was going on. And finally, the Army and just getting a little bit older woke me up to everything. And I enjoyed the hell out of college. And during the course of that, you had to take a foreign language. I had no idea. I'd never taken a foreign language before. I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I saw this, one of the choices was Russian, and I didn't know much about it. Knew that the Soviet Union, this is in the early 1980s, I knew that the Soviet Union existed, and we, in the Army, we always thought about the Soviet soldier and so forth. So here's my chance, and I see that this Russian language has this weird script. It doesn't look like English, right? In German, French, and Italian and Spanish, they all kind of look Englishy
Sure.
almost. And this is the way I'm thinking. I'll take this strange thing. It's the strange language out there. And I just went into class, and the professor was a guy sort of like me. He grew up in the area. He learned his language. He learned Russian in the Air Force. Dr. Patton was his name, and he was such an inspiration. He was such a good guy and such a great teacher. He instilled in me this curiosity for the language, and he was such a good teacher. He knew the language very well. He knew the people. He had lived in the Soviet Union, studied there. He's a PhD, obviously, this big, smart guy. And man, for me, it was just like, wow, I had never been exposed to anybody like that before. I got exposed to other teachers as well, international relations and political science. And it was just part of this process of just being sort of overwhelmed in a good way with all this kind of like, wow, there's all this stuff out there. Places, things, history, philosophy. And he got me going, especially on the language. I continued with it, tried really hard. I was running around with a Russian dictionary and just studying it all the time, listening. This is before cell phones, before internet. So you have to find live people, or you go to movie theaters, watch a Russian movie. And he set all that up. And he told me about programs where I could go. And I went to the Soviet Union in the mid 1980s. I went to Middlebury College, which was another school that did intensive Russian. And these experiences just increased my obsession and my passion for learning the language, and everything along with it. And so my 4 years at Westchester sort of culminated with these programs overseas, and in Middlebury. I continued a little bit more and then tried to get into graduate school, and I got into Columbia University at the School of International Affairs. They had the Harriman Institute at the time, which was well known for Soviet studies. I thought I sort of had it made, and I went up there, and I got just hit with the financial aspects of, I didn't get a scholarship.
Oh, yeah.
So, you go to grad school, and especially in New York City, and I did my semester up there and took Uzbek language for the first time. Loved that. And then I figured, man, I can't swing this financially. And, great professors, a great experience, but I went back into the Army again as an officer this time, and went through the training and so forth, and then got out of the Army again, started graduate school at Indiana University. And that was sort of my second stage of this process. And I did Central Asian studies, focusing on Uzbek language, and doing a program on Russian studies as well. And there I was sort of pleasantly smashed in the face with people I consider geniuses, professors that were so good and so smart and so caring for their students. scholarship. I understood what, I came to really understand what scholarship was, and meeting people. There was a professor called Yuri Bregel that was a historian on Central Asia. Devin DeWeese, a historian on Central Asia as well. Professor Fearman, another Central Asian specialist. And these people really got me going, thinking that, it allowed me to think that, I could, be in this field and, after a lot of work, end up maybe teaching at a university. And I did that sort of as a graduate student. I taught language, I taught Uzbek, and I taught Turkmen, and I also taught some other courses
Wow.
as a student. And during this process at Indiana, I went to Uzbekistan, spent a year there learning Uzbek, and this is 1989, 90, still Soviet Union. And man, I loved every moment of that. I went, again, it was the Soviet Union. No Americans there hardly in Uzbekistan. There's no embassy. Uzbekistan's not a country. It's part of the Soviet Union. And I'm just immersed 100% in Uzbek language and culture. And it was one of the best periods of my life. And one of the many great periods of my life. And that just instilled in me again further this great curiosity for the language and culture, and just I wanted to think like an Uzbek, learn language perfectly, and all these kind of great ideas and great endeavors that I just embarked upon. And I was doing that for years. I spent about 8 years as a graduate student. Right, that's a long time. But a lot of this time I spent time in Turkmenistan as well, learning Turkmen, and I was just enthralled with the whole process. And I thought, it wasn't too bad of a long shot as becoming a professional basketball player or anything like that. But becoming a professor is a hard thing, especially with the at the time, and so forth. And in that period, I for the first time, I thought about the CIA, not because I thought about a job or, watch James Bond movies. I didn't do any of that. I didn't read about it. I had no interest or no real knowledge about the agency until I went to a conference, and a CIA officer was there. And I met that officer, and it was a great lady. And she started to talk to me about the agency, about what it was all about, and most importantly for me, that they were interested in people like myself who could speak the language and knew the culture and so forth. And over time, I decided with my wife, I was married at the time, we had 2 kids, and things like health insurance and their future was becoming more important to me. When you get a job, you need a job to help take care of your kids. And the situation at Indiana was, it was not for sure where I would be able to go. And I chose to go into the agency in 1996, as
Wow.
you know.
Wow. I see. Okay. So all of this increasing like level of focus and specialization on Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Central Asia, that was totally just of your own volition, just by meeting influential professors and scholars from that region or knowledgeable of that region. I mean, you just
Yeah,
found something you
I'd even
enjoyed and
say,
dug in.
yeah, it was sort of serendipitous, as they say. It was not, there was no program. I mean, eventually there was, but I never set out to be any of this or to do any of this. It was all sort of, go to college, see what happens, right?
Hmm.
Take Russian. Oh, wow, that's great. Become obsessed with it. Where does that lead me? Well, I go back in the army, get out of the army, go to graduate, and then Uzbek at Indiana. And again, I'm just fully immersed in this whole program. Okay. And I give everything to it, and I enjoyed it. And then something else pops up, and it's the agency offering me a
Wow.
job. And that's
Wow.
the way it worked. Yeah.
Amazing. I mean, yeah, I mean, you seem like a godsend for them that you've already focused on this so much. And if I recall from Toby's book, while you were in Uzbekistan, at one point you were arrested at least once, weren't you?
Yeah. It wasn't arrest. It was sort of just the Uzbeks were, I had a great experience in Uzbekistan. I never had a bad experience in
Hmm.
Uzbekistan. The Uzbeks were wonderful people. They were fascinated by the fact that somebody like me, and again, this is in the late 80s, early 90s, it was just, they're not an independent country until a little bit later. And 1991, 92, and so forth. But the Uzbeks were fascinated that the Americans would care about Uzbek and learn Uzbek. They had Russians living there who didn't do that. And they had these, the idea of an American learning Uzbek was something that was, I was a curiosity and almost a celebrity to a degree. As my Uzbek got better, I went out and traveled and did, got on buses and trains and went out to see friends. I made friends in villages and other towns. And and when you go through these places, you're the only sort of guy looking like me around, right?
Hmm.
So there's police, and the police are, again, this is sort of a Soviet type style state, and the police have a lot of power and so forth. They'd walk up to me and say, show me your documents. And I would, and they say, who are you? And I say, well, I'm an American. They're going, what are you doing out here? And I just, oh, I'm studying. And what are you doing speaking Uzbek? They'd speak Russian to me. And I'd say, no, I'm learning Uzbek. And you become, and they're saying, and then they grab your arm in a friendly manner, but they say, come with me.
Hmm.
And they're just taking you down to the station and all this is very friendly, but it's sort of, they're cops and they can tell you what to do. And they've never seen an American passport. Is this real? What is this?
Oh, wow.
They've never seen a visa in a passport, and they don't know what's going on. And so they're just doing their job, and they got to go in and report you. And then their captain or whatever, lieutenant colonel, and it goes up the line, and everybody's sort of stunned that this is going on. There's some guy in this village or town saying that he's an American. He certainly isn't one of us. And what do we do with him? Are these documents real? Is this a real visa? What is that? They have to go up the chain of command. And at this time, it goes to Tashkent and then all the way to Moscow because
Oh my
it's the
gosh.
Soviet Union. So that process takes time. And so I'm put into I think this happened 3 or 4 times in various places. You're put into a cell, a holding area, and they feed you and they talk to you almost all night and all day. And they're not interrogating you or anything. They're just like curious about you, who you are and what you're doing. And they just can't believe it. And, the next day they get some kind of notification via telegram. There's no real phones either at this time. They're getting a telegram that, yeah, this guy's okay, let him go.
Wow.
Moscow says. So that was the process. Again, if you want to call, I had to stay in the cells, and they left the doors open, but there was they sit in the police station 24 hours, so I could go use the toilet and stuff. And they fed me well. They gave me, pillows and blankets and everything, but they said, you got to stay here tonight. And at first it was like, what? Yeah, I got this emergency contact number to call the embassy in Moscow, the U.S. embassy, but there's no phones. And what do you do? And after the second time of being arrested and let go, you sort of started learning police jargon and slang and, stuff like that. So I made the best of it, and it was part of the process. And of course, it's part of the myth and legend there's all kinds of great stories that came out of my time in Uzbekistan.
Wow,
And
that's fascinating.
all of them great, all the great stories.
It
Yeah.
certainly sounds like it. I was kind of shocked at in Toby's book. Honestly, the tone was almost kind of flippant about it, which is why I wanted to ask you and dig in a little bit, because he made it sound like you were out there, like making friends in the cafes and streets, and then later on you were making friends from inside of a jail cell as well. And
Yeah, it's easy to be flippant about it now. And
yeah.
in hindsight, there was never any danger of becoming, of it, any bad stuff happening, I
Hmm.
don't think. But of course, at the time, at the first time, I was a little bit nervous about
Oh,
things.
sure, sure. I can understand that. So going back to 1996, you joined, and was it a foregone conclusion that you would specialize in Central Asia? I mean, that's specifically what they wanted you for.
I was first a linguist. I went to a place called FBIS, Foreign Broadcast Information Service, which is now called the Open Source Center, where I simply read Uzbek, Russian, and Turkmen newspapers and picked out articles that seemed to be interesting for some. And this is in 1996, so there's all this press out there, and so I was basically translating newspapers from the languages into English and summarizing them and so forth. A kind of interesting job, but it wasn't for me. I wasn't dealing with people. And at the time, opportunities would come up where I wasn't in the Directorate of Operations. I was in this FBIS place. And at times there were offers or requests that they needed translators or linguists to go to the Directorate of Operations to do, language interpretation, stuff like that. And I got involved in projects there that involved going actually to Uzbekistan and being an interpreter. And I did that a couple times, and finally they asked me to come over and become a operations officer, or try to become one. And that's what happened in, I think, 1997. That's when I switched over to the Directorate of Operations to become a case officer.
Okay. Okay. I have to assume that involved like quite a bit of training and that sort of thing. Did
Yes.
you spend any time at all, or did you visit Afghanistan at all prior to late 2001 during your time in Central Asia at all?
No, as a student, never. And when I was posted to Uzbekistan later, my first trip to Afghanistan was in 1999 as part of a very small team of officers that went in there to visit with the warlord or Afghan resistance leader Ahmad Shah Massoud. He was a very well known ethnic Tajik leader of Afghans who fought against the Soviets and, of course, were part of this victorious effort against the Soviet Union. And he was extremely well known. He was sort of a mythological figure, even in the late 1990s, for what he did against the Soviets. And he was at that time in the late 1990s fighting against the Taliban and al-Qaeda. And at this time, we desperately needed allies in Afghanistan because al-Qaeda and bin Laden had come back to Afghanistan in the 1990s, set up shop, and the Taliban and al-Qaeda controlled 95-96% of the country. And you had these small areas that were still not controlled by the Taliban. And Massoud was in one of those areas called the Panjshir Valley, sort of north of Kabul. And we went in there starting to work with him to basically have him help us gather intelligence on Al-Qaeda. One of the other things we were doing was we were trying to get back Stinger missiles. I'm sure you're familiar with Stinger
Sure.
missiles. They're shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles that we had given the Afghans to help defeat the Soviets in the 1980s, I think mid-1980s. And there was a lot of these missiles that were unaccounted for, so we also were trying to find Afghans to give us back, or more appropriately, I guess, sell us back Stinger missiles. So we had this sort of, a couple mission sets, but it was a very, very small scale effort at the time in 1999 and in 2000, and then sort of 2001 happens and everything, literally blows up. And that's
Right.
when we went back in a big way.
Sure. So prior to September 11th, like in your years there, what was the state of? I'm not even sure what you would call it, the Central Asia desk or department within Director of Operations. Like, was it staffed by a lot of very experienced, polylingual people such as yourself? I mean, or do you feel like it was underfunded even at that time, for example?
Well, I think you can say that, these are Uzbekistan is a former Soviet country, and we did not have at the time a program where we had the languages of these former Soviet countries. Everybody still spoke Russian. That's my point.
Mm-hmm.
In these former Soviet stands and so forth. And I was sort of one of the rare people that spoke Uzbek. So it's obviously the right place for me to go. But no, we didn't have a cadre of officers who were specialists in Central Asia outside of the ones who had worked there and gained experience there. Everybody spoke Russian. And when it came to Afghanistan, we had people that spoke Farsi, some officers that spoke Iranian, Farsi.
Mm-hmm.
and most of the old hands from the Afghan period when we were helping the Afghans against the Soviets, they had retired. So there were some of these guys left. And obviously, well, our team leader for Team Alpha was one of these old Afghan hands who had worked with Afghans in the 1980s. And obviously that experience was invaluable. And he spoke Farsi. But when it came to Uzbek, I think I was the only speaker in the agency.
Okay. Okay. I see. In the agency, you were the only Uzbek speaker?
Yeah, I mean, there weren't
Wow.
that many Uzbek speakers in the United
Sure.
States either. I
Sure.
mean,
Sure. Sure.
at the time, especially, I remember when I worked at Indiana, I was doing what do you call it? We had young students, undergrads coming and asking what Uzbek was, and I said it's a language, and they said, was it like Fortran and COBOL? They thinking it's a computer language.
Oh
Uh,
wow.
so,
Wow.
so at the time, Uzbek was not something that most people in America knew,
Sure.
existed, so to speak.
Okay. Okay. Totally got it. Totally got it. So September 11th, where were you physically when those attacks occurred, and how did you react? What happened in the first day or two there?
Yeah, I was actually flying from Uzbekistan to England, to London, to attend a conference
Hmm.
on Stinger missile retrieval. And when I landed, I got out of the airplane, and I saw not videos, but camera, what do you call it? Television screens in the
Hmm.
airport at Heathrow of, this stuff happening. The attacks had already taken place. The towers were down, and it was in that aftermath that I learned of what happened. And it was, you can just sort of people milling around and asking questions, saying what happened. And that's how I learned at Heathrow Airport what happened. And then not really fully understanding what was going on. So essentially I never went. The conference was canceled, and I got on the next plane that I could back to Uzbekistan.
Hmm. Okay. I see. And was there a lot to do in Uzbekistan, like in the immediate aftermath, or were you kind of having to wait for word
No, no,
from DC?
Uzbekistan was a small place in terms of an embassy and so forth. But we obviously everybody knew at the embassy that there would be a role for us or for, the embassy personnel, not maybe perhaps in Afghanistan itself, but we would be one of those places where U.S. forces or U.S. personnel or whatever U.S. presence would go into Afghanistan from a number of countries, and one of those would be Uzbekistan. So everybody knew at the embassy from the ambassador down, and we had immediately had visits from Department of Defense. Rumsfeld came to Uzbekistan, so you had these, and they were talking with the Uzbekistan government, of course, and that whole process started very intensely, and it became clear within a few days that we would be a launch pad, one of the launch pads from which the movements into Uzbekistan would take place.
Okay. Okay. I see. And how quickly did it become clear that you would be going? Was that something you volunteered for, or were you quickly selected?
I guess it's a mixture of both. Since I had been to Afghanistan before, I knew Uzbek. We didn't know really at the time. We had no relations with the Uzbek contingent in Afghanistan
Hmm.
directly. We had Masood, but he was killed by al-Qaeda in an
Right.
assassination on 9 September
Hmm.
2001, 2 days before 9/11. So very quickly, a team assembled, was sent to Uzbekistan, and launched into Afghanistan. The Jawbreaker team. That team was sent to work with the ethnic Tajiks who had been under or who were under Masood, and they would go into the Panjshir Valley and work with that contingent. And then it was quickly determined that there would be another team called Team Alpha that would go in and work with the ethnic Uzbek contingent led by Abdul Rashid Dostum, the leader or warlord of the Uzbek side, who was also fighting against the Taliban and Al Qaeda. So that I became a member of that team that arrived from headquarters, and I joined that team in Uzbekistan.
Okay. What was your understanding? Like, what I guess was your briefing going in? I mean, did you have very, very clear objectives that you would be carrying out, or was it just like a extremely like dynamic, ever changing situation the whole time you're gearing up and ready, getting ready to leave?
Yeah, a little, mostly the latter of what you said there. I was a team member. I wasn't a team leader. As I said, we had JR, who was our team leader, who the team was assembled in the headquarters area. Some of the men knew each other. Most of us did not know each other. And most of us had never worked with each other before. And it was a mixture of paramilitary officers. Most of us were paramilitary officers. I was not. I was a case officer. JR was a case officer. We had a medic, Mark. We had a special forces officer, a captain, Justin, who joined us,
Hmm.
who, didn't wear his uniform. He was seconded to the agency. But the rest of the guys were paramilitary ground branch officers from the Special Activities Division, one of whom was, of course, Mike Spann. So this team was assembled at headquarters. It came out to Tashkent. I was picked up from there, and I started to interact with them. I had met a couple of them before, but I didn't know them well. And I'd been to Afghanistan before. I'd been to other areas, and these guys, they're the paramilitary folks are a different breed, so to speak, given their expertise and skills and experiences in the military and special operations. So I was immediately sort of struck by their demeanor, the way they acted, and so forth. And they're sort of they viewed this differently. They viewed this deployment in a way as what it was. I sort of just saw this as another foray into Afghanistan,
Hmm.
and they sort of saw things more starkly. And as that sunk into me, for example, did you write a will? No. Why do I need to write a will? And
Oh wow.
and some of these guys saying, well, we might need, a little dramatically, but still very, it was truth. They're the way they were sort of programmed. We might not be coming back. And I remember, okay, okay, and then you think about it a little bit, and I didn't write a will. I didn't have a will, so all these things were going through their minds. They're expressing these thoughts to me. And Alex, our deputy chief, he was a special forces Green Beret command sergeant major, the highest enlisted rank in the army. And this guy is just steeped in experience and knowledge and expertise. And he started questioning me like, okay, who are you? He thought, he called me professor because and he said, do you know how to use it? I said, well, I was in the army. He said, really? Oh, that's good. What'd you do? Like push paper? I said, no, I was in artillery. He said, oh, okay, that's okay. What'd and I went through the parachute training school. And so gradually he came to accept me. But at first it was like, who is this idiot? He's this, he's being, he's selected because he speaks the language, obviously, but what else does he bring to the table? Can he, do anything that we need, that would
Hmm.
make him qualified otherwise? And I kind of just maybe barely made it in that
I
regard.
got you. I
I
got you.
could walk and talk, and I wasn't a total idiot, I guess.
Hmm.
But anyway, that sort of process of becoming associated with a paramilitary, team was very quick and very, stark, and it woke me up a little bit to what I was getting into, and I felt a little bit, obviously, there's some anxiousness there, and so forth. And I guess for me, the less I knew, the better. What we were getting into.
I see.
Uh,
I see. Do you feel like you were a little bit more confident and relaxed because of all of your dealings with people, cultures, and that sort of thing in the region, more so perhaps than the ground branch guys? Or
oh
were
yeah,
you like maybe naive about what was going to be coming?
yes, both. I was confident and naive, and I guess maybe that's part. That can be. You can easily do those two things at once, right? I
Sure.
had been dealing with Central Asians for many years, Uzbeks, Afghans, you name it. I knew the language Uzbek very well. I knew the culture fairly well. I had, little experience in Afghanistan, but I was the only guy in our team who had ever been to Afghanistan. So I felt good, and I did not feel afraid in regards to the people I was going to deal with, because I thought I knew them well, I understood them well, and maybe here's where the naivete come in. I trusted them, and this was the case when we landed. When we were inserted, we meet these guys, and I immediately, you start talking to them. Okay, they're a different breed now. Don't get me wrong, and I can talk about them in a second. But the Uzbeks and the others we met with Dostum were people that I immediately was able to communicate with, and I felt good about. The
Hmm.
other guys on the team were like, who's these guys? Can we trust them? And all that sort of very appropriate caution that you have to display and show, and be in that state so you can make the right decisions and so forth. But me, not having no responsibility other than the language culture guy and talking to the guys, gathering intelligence, my role was different. So I'm glad, obviously, I did not have that burden like JR had, especially, and Alex had, of being the leaders of the team, where they had to think of the mission and security. And
Hmm.
I wasn't really thinking of any of that. My mission was to get to know these guys, these Afghans, figure out what's going on with them, so to speak.
Hmm. So, what was your initial opinion of Doostum and the Northern Alliance, and how did that change, or did it change over time?
It didn't really change over time. What immediately impressed me was the fact that these men were cavalrymen. The vast majority of the people we worked with, Dostum's men, were horsemen, right? They were horse cavalry fighters who had been fighting on horseback for years. And they were obviously skilled horsemen. But the ethnic Uzbeks were essentially the only cavalry force in Afghanistan.
Hmm.
And this is in 2001, right? All the other ethnic groups, while they may have rode horses, frequently, there was no fighting force that was essentially a cavalry force, and that was Dostum. So they're a special type of people. They were extremely tough, physically, mentally, and just their ability to endure hardship. And they were fighting for decades, some of them, right? And 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 the sort of inherent brutality that comes along with all of that, fighting in wars against the Soviets, for the Soviets, in the civil war in Afghanistan in the 1990s, ethnic, fighting, you name. I'm just, it's sort of that hardship, that and that brutality that comes with that was something I had no experience with, really. I was used to other types of Central Asians who did not come up that way.
Hmm.
So that gradually, that was something I had to try to be cognizant of and understand. And it was really no problem, because from day one we were faced with, and because I'm speaking to these guys, learning about their stories, they're explaining to me things, and I'm just sort of like, wow, every day these guys are telling me things. And the wounded start coming in, guys who I'll never forget. I think it was the second day we were there. A guy came in, one of the commanders we were going to work with, an Uzbek commander. We were moving out to see him, and before we got there, he came to us, but he had been shot in the face, his jaw was gone. And our medic and I went over to him, and our medic said, there's nothing we can do. Mark said, there's nothing we can do for this guy. And it's just a terrible scene
Hmm.
to see this guy in this terrible situation. And in any case, those kind of moments became very frequent when I was sort of slapped in the face with this reality of the brutality of Afghanistan and fighting a war with these men, and hearing about their stories, and seeing them in action, so to speak, the way they dealt with situations.
Hmm. I'll bet. How quickly were you very close to the action? Like, were you hearing airstrikes all day and all night, or getting in contact with Taliban forces right off the bat, or did that kind of gradually build up?
It gradually built up, and what changed things, I think, dramatically for us was when we were able, or when the ODA 595, the Green Beret detachment, came in. they brought with them that organic capability to call in airstrikes on the enemy forces, on the Taliban and al-Qaeda. And when that happened, we started, thanks to their capability, to get closer and so forth, and see things happen more and more. And so that was when things started. And that started, I think, just within the first week. So you had a couple days of sort of movement and so forth. And then, gradually you'd go to the command posts or observation posts where things, you could actually see things happening. But it was not this stark combat at all initially.
Okay, I see. Were the agencies the U.S. government's goals, were they aligned with Dostum's goals and the Northern Alliance right off the bat, or were they kind of at odds and trying to find a balance in between the two, perhaps?
Well, I would say the general goals and missions of both of our groups, the agencies, obviously the ODA, the U.S. military, and Dostum were all the same: to kill the enemy, essentially. We're there to facilitate that with, we'd gather intelligence, but we'd also have the ability or capability to bring in to the Afghans, our Afghan allies, weapons and ammunition, essentially, that they didn't have, which they're in just dire need of. So every night was an airdrop for the first couple of weeks. The ground branch guys would set up the drop zones, and we'd retrieve the drop materials, and then they'd give them out. And the responsibility, and of course the Afghan Uzbeks were just overjoyed to get these drops of equipment and ammunition and so forth, because that enabled them to do their job better. And Dostum was immediately interested and willing to do what other Afghan warlords and leaders were not, which was to go out and fight the enemy, shed blood, and suffer shedding their own blood, shed blood of the enemy, and then, taking casualties. And Dostum was immediately willing to do that with us. And some of the other warlords, or most of them, were not. I mean, there weren't many teams in Afghanistan at the time, essentially two. But what impressed everybody about Dostum, he was a go-getter. He was going to fight. And he took what we gave him and he fought very, very quickly, effectively. And it sort of proved to everybody. And Dostum had been an unknown quantity to us. We did not know much about it. Well, what we knew about him was oftentimes negative, that he switched sides, you couldn't depend on him, and he was brutal. Certainly he was brutal against the enemy, but he was always, at least as far as my assessment of, he was the perfect warlord for us at the time. He was willing to do what we wanted him to do. And JR, especially, his job, one of JR's many jobs, was to ensure that Dostum got along with our other allies. I mean, this was a very tenuous relationship that we had with other allies, the other ethnic groups, Tajiks, Hazaras, Uzbeks, and others. But we had to all get along, and JR had to ensure or make sure that Dostum and the other warlords did get along. And that took a lot of work, a lot of effort, but it was successful. So one of the things that made our team successful was our ability, namely JR's ability, to make sure that these various Afghan factions fought together and did not fight each other, and allowed us to work as a united front against the enemy, Taliban and al-Qaeda.
Yeah, that it just sounds like you guys really had your work cut out for you. That instantaneous shift in the power balance in that whole region, and trying to kind of navigate that between all of these guys, that had to be incredibly difficult. So it sounds like JR certainly had his work cut out for him, and you did as well.
Well, yeah, and that, in hindsight, when I look back on this, one of the things that Alex and JR did, and any leader had to do at the time, was to engage in, on a daily basis, this thing called, we call risk calculus. How do we complete the mission? How do we not get killed or put ourselves in unnecessary danger? How do we do all this? And I am amazed at the team's ability to do that, how JR and Alex did that, essentially JR. figuring all this while at the same time sending us off, sort of breaking rules, if you will, about how small units should act. I mean, we
Hmm.
were sent off in twos and threes and even ones for long periods of time.
Oh, wow.
And we didn't have robust communications. Let's put it that way. We didn't have night vision equipment. We didn't have body armor. We didn't have things, but we had to get a job done. And guys like me were saying, yeah, don't worry about it. Let's go do this. Let's go meet this commander. Commander Dostum says we got to go meet this guy and get him to join. And if we go out there and do an airdrop, he'll join us. But it takes a 14-hour ride on the
Hmm.
horse. And JR and Alex, they engaged in that process of determining what was prudent, what was mission necessary, and what was safe or, unsafe, but you got to do it. And it was just amazing, especially in hindsight, to do that sort of, after action report to see how, good the decision making was conducted by JR.
Hmm.
And at the same time, taking tremendous risk. Mike, Mark, and Justin went down, hundreds of miles south, with Afghans we didn't know, in order to gain the confidence and support of another warlord, the Hazara warlord in Bamyan province. We went out in small groups and did that with more other, not warlords, but principal leaders and so forth. And that was just amazing to be able to do that and be able to do it successfully and no one's getting killed.
Wow. This is, I'm just amazed that JR as sort of like a small unit leader is able to make so many things happen in rapid succession and have them go so well. To your knowledge, was there a lot of like were there misunderstandings between him and headquarters, say, or were there unrealistic expectations at any point, or friction between the headquarters and the team,
Yeah,
that sort of thing?
that's a very good question. And again, I wasn't the leader,
Right.
but what I observed, I mean, we got to see, because it's such a small team and the decisions that JR made, these are not made in, dark locked rooms, right? These are decisions he's making with our input. And there's sort of this, military democracy or agency democracy where people are saying things and then, JR makes a decision and that's it. We go with it. So, but when it comes to headquarters, the beauty of it all was that JR, his main contact was a guy named Hank Crumpton. He was in charge of the Afghanistan effort from the director of operations. And he and JR would be on the radio. I don't know how often, but once every couple days. And when JR had a question or a request, he would go right to this guy who would say yes or no. And most of the time, my guess is 99% of the time, when JR made a request, he Hank's response was, "Okay, when do you need it by, or what can I do to make things happen for you?" So it was the chain of command was very clear. It was very direct, and Hank's boss was Kofor Black, the head of Counterterrorism Center, and Kofor Black spoke to the director of the agency, and he was in meetings with the president and so forth. So this very, very truncated, direct chain of command was, I would say, very effective in allowing us to get decisions made and getting the support we needed very, very quickly from the headquarters and other elements. And again, at the time, you have to remember there's very, very few Americans in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
We have Team Alpha, there's Jawbreaker, and that was it for a number of weeks, I think. And so it was easy to do that. It was easy to get the attention of the headquarters folks because there's no other game in town. But I'll sing the praises of JR and Alex and Hank and Kofor, to the day I die. I mean, they were just great, great leaders who came about in this very, very difficult time, a risk laden time for the United States, for the agency, for us. And, the agency had to pivot. I'm sort of going off track, but, before 9/11, we were in Cold War type
Hmm.
espionage agency, essentially. And then 9/11 happens, and guess what? Everybody becomes a counterterrorism officer or a
Hmm.
semi paramilitary person. And from the people in logistics to the people at the computer, there was a unity and sense of purpose that was, that we had never seen before or since, I think, or I had never seen. So that pivot and everything, Hank, I don't think he had military experience, but he didn't need it. He was a great leader and he understood what the mission was and how to get things done. I don't think Kofor had a military experience either. But these people stepped up and they were the right people at the right time. And that's what makes me so curious about how successful the agency can be, because we select very good people.
Hmm.
And that's what allowed me to stay in the agency, or kept me in the agency for many years after I could have retired, was just the quality of people.
Before we go on, I want to tell you all about a new podcast from Tenderfoot TV called To Die For. Imagine you were a fly on the wall at a dinner between the Mafia, the CIA, and the KGB. That's where this unprecedented podcast begins. Brought to you by the makers of the hit podcast To Live and Die in LA, To Die For marks the first time a Russian trained honey trap has told her story from beginning to end. Taught to seduce men for their secrets and sometimes their lives, Alia Rosa was trained to believe that her body no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the state. She was meticulously trained to be the perfect weapon, able to seduce her targets into compromising situations that have ended careers and sometimes lives. From Tenderfoot TV, the studio that brought you Up and Vanished, and To Live and Die in LA. Make sure you check out To Die For, available beginning on March 26th, wherever you get your podcasts. Yeah, they certainly prove their worth through this mission. No question about it. It really is incredible. I've heard it described as one of the most successful and lopsided, really, like small unit actions in the history of warfare. What you guys accomplished, and that is no small feat, certainly.
And if you compare, now the agency was, came out of, or was born out of, the OSS, right?
Hmm.
That began in World War II. And so the paramilitary beginnings of the agency were revisited again. I mean, we had it during Vietnam, right? But those guys were gone. And then suddenly we become the OSS again in some ways. And, people riding horses and mules and donkeys and all that stuff, just like in Burma and all that, you name it. It was just, we harkened back to our roots, and it was a successful endeavor.
Yeah, it was really just an astonishing accomplishment all around. So, David, you mentioned Mike Spann at the beginning. Of course, can you tell me about him? Did you first meet him at the beginning of this mission? I take it.
No, I met Mike when he came to Uzbekistan to help train local Uzbeks
Hmm.
in paramilitary activity. This is
Okay.
before 9/11, before obviously we knew anything about what was going to happen. But Mike was a paramilitary officer. He was new. He essentially, his first deployment, I think, had happened months earlier, but he was young, just like we all were. Most of us were young. But Mike came to Uzbekistan, and I met him when he came for these deployments to Uzbekistan, for weeks at a time, and he'd go back and then come back. And Mike he was a Marine officer, extremely patriotic. He exuded patriotism. He exuded a sense of mission. There was nothing ambiguous about Mike Spann. Just a patriot warrior. He was from Alabama. He grew up there and had that sort of Alabama or Southern air to him. And we got along. Everybody got along, and I was impressed with Mike, with his seriousness, and I became further impressed by Mike's seriousness and sort of attitude towards work and being a professional as the deployment continued. Mike and I, it's not that we didn't have much in common, but we were from different places. I was sort of a language culture guy. I had my military background and stuff, and Mike was a Marine, but we quickly gelled in the sense that we complemented each other because we did a lot of work together during the deployment. I'll never forget Mike's attitude and approach towards what I was doing, sort of case officer intelligence stuff. And Mike was also a case officer, but he hadn't the experience like I had in that part of the world, and he was always asking me questions, always coming up with plans and ideas about things that were extremely impressive and showed the attention to detail that Mike had towards the job. When he said, we had there were prisoners that we'd come across, and we'd get a chance to talk to them and sort of very quick. We didn't have a whole lot of time to do things, but and I'd tell, oh, we're going to talk to some prisoners. Mike, when he heard things like we are going to talk to Taliban, he came up to me, and Mike was usually he didn't never had to ask permission. He would always tell you what he wanted. But he came to me, please, Dave, please, let me talk to the prisoners. Let me go with you, because I had the language, right? And I said, sure, Mike, yeah. And he says, well, what's our plan? After he got permission to come. What's our plan? I said, well, I've done this a lot. We'll go ask this. And he didn't like that sort of flippant response. And the night before we went out, he sat with his little flashlight and wrote up in his tiny script dozens and dozens of questions that we should ask these prisoners. And I looked at it and I just, well, we don't probably have time for all this, but these are all good. And, they were very, very thoughtful, spot on questions. But it just showed Mike's attitude. He was always wanting to be at the tip of the spear, as we say. He was very cognizant of where he was, what he was doing, and what his purpose was and mission. That was something that always anybody who was around Mike was impressed with, that, because there was, again, no ambiguity about Mike, where he stood on things, and his professionalism was extremely impressive. I'll just say, Mike he was married to another CIA officer. He had 2 girls, 2 daughters, and an infant son in 2001. And he was, a devoted family man as well. He had parents, obviously. He had sisters. He was a great guy. Great warrior.
Yeah, I've read nothing but positive things about him from everyone. I can tell he touched a lot of lives, certainly. And that, kind of brings us to really the big question. Can you tell me a little bit about this Qali-i Jangi prison and what happened there?
Yeah, 24 November, we had taken Mazar-i-Sharif. That was the big city in the north. That was our main objective, to go up there and liberate the city. And after that happened, the war effort sort of moved east to the area of Kunduz, which was a couple hours east of Mazar-i-Sharif. And from that period when we liberated the city, about 2 weeks, we were engaged in all kinds of activities, and our team was being split up again, doing different things. We'd have a group, JR, and the leadership would move one way to go to Kunduz to sort of fight the battle, and we'd sort of rotate personnel back and forth to other areas. We'd go out to meet other warlords, and we always had a small group, a couple guys back at Mazar-i-Sharif at our little headquarters. And at the time, I was back there, and Mike was also back there. We got word on, I forget which day it was, but we got word that a bunch of al-Qaeda prisoners were surrendering. So obviously that's a big deal for us. And you have to understand, your audience has to understand this context, that after 9/11, we were attacked, thousands of Americans died, and it was understood or determined that al-Qaeda did it. Okay, what do you do now? Well, you go and try to get al-Qaeda, right? You try to not only kill them, but you try to figure out, and this is what the agency was all about, getting the intelligence to allow us to understand if and when another attack was going to take place. Because at the time, we had been hurt a great deal. The attacks in Washington, New York, the plane in Pennsylvania. I mean, and this concern that was well founded that these things were going to happen again because we had foiled Al Qaeda attacks prior to 9/11. And now, the gloves were off, so to speak, and we needed to make sure that we were getting the intelligence that was possible for us to figure or understand where the next threat was coming from. So at the time, in late November 2001, when you are told, or when headquarters got word that we're getting access to perhaps hundreds of al-Qaeda personnel, not Taliban fighters, but al-Qaeda personnel, this just blew everybody's mind. And it sort of was the reason we were in Afghanistan. We were there to get access to information that would help us defend ourselves and our allies, right? And stave off other attacks. So there was unambiguous orders from headquarters that was, when these guys, if they are indeed prisoners, you will go and talk to them and gather intelligence and start the process of figuring out who they are, what access they have, and what information they have. And that process starts by just going out and taking pictures of them, jotting down where they're from and so forth. And that fell to me and Mike on 25 November. We had essentially 400 Al-Qaeda members, and these were bona fide Al-Qaeda members. It became clear as soon as we started talking to them that they were Al-Qaeda and not Taliban. They were all foreigners. And the thing that impressed me most on 25 November in the morning was the immediate thing that impressed me was the fact that they were speaking various languages. I'm not an Arabic speaker, but there's some of it I understand. So you have Arabic being spoken by some of these guys, and they're telling you they're from all the Arab countries. You name the Arab country, Middle East, Arab countries, North African Arabs, Arabs from all over the world, Persian Gulf Arabs. And then you got all these other people from all over the world, from the former Soviet Union, Tatars, Uyghurs from China, Dagestanis, Chechens, Azerbaijanis, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz,
Wow.
Tajiks, Turks from Turkey, Turks from Germany, Malaysians, what was the other? Indonesia, Filipino Muslims, Black African Muslims. And then you got white guys that look like just guys from, down the road, right? You have Australians. We didn't know this at the time, but there were guys, it turned out to be from Australia. We had two Americans there, two American citizens. One, John Walker Lind, of course, who's more well known. So it immediately struck me, and that the word, I guess I'd use is diversity, the diversity of these men. And when you start talking to them in the various languages, some spoke English, but they would tell you, I'm an Al-Qaeda guy. I'm fighting. I was trained at such and such a camp. I have this skill set. I knew some of the bombers, the Saudis and some of them are obviously, lying about things or saying other stories like, hey, I'm just lost. I'm a tourist. I'm coming here to help people, or, I'm searching for an understanding of Islam, and they gave me a weapon, and so I started fighting. Or I went to a training camp. I got sucked into it. The sort of spectrum of stories that you might hear people like this tell. But the one thing that was in common is that those who, that would say so, told us they had given allegiance, so to speak, an oath, a bayat to Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. So that was something that impressed me. And as Mike started to understand this, we knew this was a group of people that was extremely important in terms of what they possessed and in terms of intelligence.
That's incredible. The number and diversity, like you mentioned, of the people. And at this point, it was just you and Mike basically that were asking questions. of all these guys? I mean, it seems like a tremendous opportunity to, exploit.
Yeah, as I said, now it is an odd thing, right? I mean, but there's very few Americans there.
Sure,
There's
sure.
the capability. I mean, this was what the CIA was all about. But most of our this happened quickly. Nothing happens in Afghanistan with great planning or precision, right? It's managed chaos, and these guys sort of show up, and we're tasked to go out and talk to them, and that's there was essentially myself and Mike, and there were a couple other people there as well from our team, but they were not at the fort. They had other things to do. And our other team was other members of the team were out in Kunduz area fighting the fight,
Hmm.
enabling our allies to win the fight against al-Qaeda and Taliban in Kunduz. So yeah, it's just we were there, we were available, and obviously I had the languages or some of the languages that allowed me to go out and talk to these men. And we did have a contingent of Afghan security forces that were sent with us or that were already there. But these men were sort of the JV, the junior varsity guys. All the good guys, all the very serious fighters and leaders and so forth were out fighting the fight in Kunduz. So we had this sort of, young men, people we didn't know who were our security that day. But again, this was just another day. It was almost just another day in Afghanistan.
Wow.
Obviously, for us, there was more significance to it because of who these people were. But I don't think Mike or I sensed any different type of risk than what we had every day before that.
Okay, interesting. So I've seen some footage. I guess that there was like a German documentary crew was there at the same time, or
Yeah,
something.
One of Dostum's men was there taking footage of the prisoners as
Okay.
they were coming out of one of the buildings. That's what you'll probably see. And then there was a German crew. We had not seen any foreigners, meaning outsiders, until I had not seen any until 25 November, until I ran back there and saw
Hmm.
these guys.
Oh,
And it
okay.
was indeed a German led journalist crew with a camera as well. So we have two sets of eyes, so to speak. We have the Dostum's cameraman, or whatever you want to call him, media person taking video
Hmm.
inside the southern compound where the prisoners were, and then this outside of that there was this northern compound where you had the German guy.
Okay. Okay. I see. I see. So since you mentioned John Walker Lynn, did you guys get to speak to him face to face while you were there?
Well, Mike identified him as a probable or possible, English speaker. He pulled him out of the crowd and tried to talk to him. He refused to speak, and then Mike, I came over and asked Mike what's going on, and Mike told me, and we tried a little bit of good cop, bad cop, but he refused to speak. He did not speak one word to us. And
Gotcha.
so after, a few minutes were spent on him, he was sent back into the line or the group of prisoners, and Mike was busy speaking to other English speakers.
Okay. Okay. I see. And who was the other American, by the way? I don't even think I knew that there was another American citizen.
He was I believe a Saudi or a Yemeni American.
Okay. Okay.
He
I
was
see.
from that background, but he was actually born in the United States and had a U.S.
Got it.
passport.
Got it. Okay. Okay. I just had missed that somehow. So if I recall correctly, some of these prisoners had somehow smuggled weapons or grenades or something in with them just because they had not been properly searched at some point. Is that
Yes.
right?
So they surrender, and I put that word in quotes.
Hmm.
We did not have a role in. It's you have to understand that these activities, if you will, were we're just 2 and 3 Americans, right?
Right.
We are
Right.
not in
Totally.
charge of anything. The Afghans are in charge by design. We try to exert our influence and so forth when we can, but this was an Afghan operation. And these guys came in vehicles that on 24 November, some of those, they came fully armed with their weapons. And then as the process of moving them into the fort continued, they were disarmed to a degree, but it was dark when they came. So, and there are no, you have to understand, 2000, there's electricity is really not available.
Hmm.
Flashlights aren't ubiquitous. There's not many flashlights. So these guys are just sort of taken off the trucks and thrown into they were searched to a degree. They were thrown into this cellar area, 400 of them, of a building. And the next morning, they were going to come up and be fully searched, taken out, and made available to us. That was the plan.
Okay, I've got it. So, can you tell me, as I'm trying to understand kind of the set pieces here, how many friendly Afghans were there? You mentioned like the JV team. Were we talking about 20 guys or 50 guys or
Well,
something like
yeah,
that?
there's sort of the men who are assigned there to be security. I'd estimate 40 to 60
Okay.
who have weapons and rifles and machine guns, PK machine guns, who are fully armed and sort of surrounding the prisoners. Now, they made the decision, which, is probably a good one. They're not going to have men armed with a lot of weaponry inside the mix with the prisoners.
Yeah.
So you were surrounded by men with guns, and then there's another ring of sort of people who show up who are allies who have guns as well. So you probably have a couple hundred men, but only 40 to 60 are actually assigned with weapons. And then you have a intelligence unit, if you will, that was friendly, one of our allies,
Mm-hmm.
but 6, 7 guys who are intelligence specialists who are going to help us talk to the prisoners. And it's a very cursory thing. Our job that morning was to take photos of everybody, figure out and get their documents if they have it, meaning passports, ID cards, whatever. Get that stuff and get that information, get their names, countries of origins, and see if they say anything of value. And it immediately became clear, they had some documents. They were talking about who they were. And many of them were saying, yeah, I studied or I went to training in this camp, Al Farouk camp, whatever camp in Afghanistan. I learned about toxins, I learned about, dirty bombs.
Oh my gosh.
I knew, again, I knew the guys who, or some of the Saudis who, flew the planes in. So it was like almost overwhelming, right? It's not, you have your little notebook there, you write a few things, and then, guys are talking for, minutes, and you're running out of pages already,
Mm-hmm.
and you got to move to the next guy. Our
My
goal
gosh.
was
Yeah.
to get eyes on every single guy, get their information, and then sort of regroup and figure out what to do next. And that's what we started to do. And we got through a lot of the process there. And of course, we had our Afghan allies doing the same.
Okay. I see. And is it correct to assume then that overnight the guys in the cellar had decided that they were going to try to break out or
Yeah.
maybe take over the prison, something like that?
Yeah. What we came to, and I think we understood this later, obviously, that there was a faction or group or core of these men who were, bent on, part of the plan was to be like this Trojan horse, if you will, to go in there and to carry out this uprising. They had other ideas where they didn't know they were going to be sent to the fort. The original plan was to send them somewhere else where they could just sort of scatter and cause a general uprising. That was something we learned out later, but they were sent to the fort in this sort of compact place with walls. And you had this core of people sort of reveal to the mass of prisoners the night before what's going to take place. And some of these prisoners said no, or expressed some kind of, what do you call it, opposition
Mm-hmm.
to this plan, and they were killed that night
Oh, wow.
inside this cellar or basement area of this. So the next morning when we came, we're not only pulling, the Afghans are not only taking out prisoners, they're taking out dead bodies or wounded men
Hmm.
who had been wounded the night before, not wounded weeks before, days before. We had some of those as well, and we brought Afghan medical doctors. As soon as we saw the number of wounded people coming from, wounds from various times, we called or asked the Afghans to get doctors, and they quickly brought 2 medical doctors to the fort, with supplies and water and so forth. These men were in bad shape, many of them, physically bad shape. So, it was this process of, we're going to have to care and feed these men, while at the same time trying to figure out who they are and so forth. So yeah, that process was hectic and chaotic, but there was a process where you see these men lined up in this open area,
Hmm.
and there's no flex cuffs, there's no means to hold these men, really, except by using their turbans to tie their arms behind their back. And that's what the Afghans were doing.
Okay, okay, I see. So, were there any like last minute warning signs or anything like that before the shooting actually started that you recall?
No, not really. I was told by the Afghan intelligence chief there that there were 30 to 40 left, perhaps, inside the cellar, and that he, inside the basement, and he, advised that these men are probably the ones you really want to talk to because they're the ones who don't want to come out.
Mm. Hmm.
And so, we agreed that we would wait until everybody came out and we got pictures and sort of basic data on every person. And that then we would sort of go home and regroup. So there was no indication. I mean, probably in hindsight there was, but at the time we did not. No, we were not planning for this, obviously.
Okay, I've got it. So once these guys, I assume it was these 30 to 40 that were the last holdouts there. Mike was he like positioned pretty close to the actual cellar, like he was the closest guy on hand, or was
Yes,
that not how it was
yes.
working?
Mike was very close to the area where the men were coming out of from this basement, and he was with the medical doctors and the wounded. There was sort of a, what do you call it, medical point that was right outside the door almost, because these men couldn't walk. Some of them you had to drag
Mm-hmm.
them out, so you set up this very basic medical place, and Mike was there because a bunch of these men spoke English who had been wounded, and I was at a different area further away from where Mike was, and I was individually, we'd pick out men who chose to speak to us and take them to another area, nearby, very close, but just to speak one on one with them. And that's what I was doing at the time when everything started. So, and I assume your question is, how's it started? And uh, it started when the men downstairs, the remaining men downstairs, came up the steps with weapons, pistols and hand grenades, essentially, and started to, fight their way out of that basement area into the larger field area where all the other prisoners were tied up.
Okay, I see. Did it kind of descend into chaos quickly, or was it like a slow spreading sort of thing? Because there's just hundreds of people there at this point, I assume.
Right, right. So obviously, in hindsight, you can say that these men were ready for this, but there were a few seconds where things were, especially for me, very unclear what's going on. You hear shouting, you hear explosions, and you hear gunfire from, about 75 meters from where I am, and 10 to 15 meters where from Mike is. And so you kind of get the idea that things are going poorly there, that something's happened. And the seconds, it's to me very, still to this day, I think about this, those seconds in between me fully realizing what's going on and until I take action. It's a few seconds, but I very clearly even now remember I had a pistol, a 9mm Browning 9mm pistol in my holster. That when all this started, I drew the pistol, and although I had fired my Kalashnikov rifle prior to that day in Afghanistan in combat, I had not fired the pistol. And I remember drawing the pistol and saying to myself, "Man, it's been a long time since you use this pistol. Do you know what you're doing?" I asked myself that question. And I
Hmm.
looked at the pistol in my hand, sort of, wondering out loud. And, sort of before I was able to answer or sort of, what do you want to ruminate on it further, I had to start using it. And obviously I was able, thanks to my training, years prior, I used the pistol, but I shot all my rounds. I had 75 rounds, five magazines, one in and four on my belt, and I fired all my magazines in the course of that, and in very close proximity to the enemy. I mean, they were shooting at me and chasing me and so forth, and then I moved over to Mike as well, and took his rifle. He had a Kalashnikov style rifle, and he was already killed at the time. But I took his rifle that the al-Qaeda guys were trying to take from him. It was sort of, Mike had it around his arms, and the men on top of him, I shot those men and took Mike's rifle, and later moved out to another part of the compound.
Hmm. So you had eyes on Mike when he was killed then?
No, I did not have
Okay.
eyes on Mike. I moved towards Mike. When I was standing there, I drew my pistol. A couple things happened. One of the Afghan intelligence officers was running towards me, and he was holding up his little notebook. And he came to me, and in Farsi, he just said, "Get out of here, scram, run away." And he said, first he said, "Don't shoot, it's me, it's me." And he
Hmm.
wanted to make sure I wasn't going to shoot him because, he's running towards me, and he put out his little notebook as a sign that, yay, you know, I guess, he didn't know if I knew who he was, but he stopped just for a second and he said, "Fararkun, just get out of here." And he just went on running. And I was a little, I don't want to say dumbfounded, but I was not sure of what to do. And I stood there. And then I hear Mike's voice and he called my name. And that's when I started to move towards Mike. And there were prisoners in this mass. I couldn't run directly straight angle to Mike. I had to run around some prisoners. And as I did this, another prisoner came out, and he started running towards me with a pistol, and he was shooting at me. And thank goodness, obviously, he was a poor shot. But it took me just a few milliseconds to understand that this guy was actually shooting. It's the first time I fired my pistol, and it took a few milliseconds to register that this guy was actually trying to kill me, and I couldn't understand why. When I realized that this young man, whom I had seen as a prisoner, half an hour before, talked to, then now he was actually running towards me, shooting with a pistol, shooting at me. And I saw his face; it was cringing, and he didn't know. I don't. He wasn't good with a pistol. I don't know how much experience he had, but I remember very, very clearly going through this process of milliseconds and feeling that time is slowing down to the point where I was confused as to why am I seeing things and feeling like things are in slow motion. And I saw the shell casing come out of that guy's pistol. It was one of these Makarov Soviet style pistols. And I remember seeing that very clearly and saying, "This kid's trying to kill me." And just just sort of, realizing that, and then deciding that I need to fire my pistol and shoot him. And that's what I did. And as he crumbled and I ran by him, I looked and just looked at him, and I still was curious as, you know, why did this guy do this? Why? What? Talk about naivete. I guess that's a good example there. But this strange sensation that would be part of my next 18 minutes, or the whole day, and the rest of the days. But just this strange place I had never been before, mentally and physically, physiologically, of of slow motion, no sense of hearing, tunnel vision. I was yelling at the top of as I went to Mike, as Mike's body was there, I was kicking his body and yelling at him, but I couldn't hear my voice. And I was feeling very, another sort of strange thing was just started this part of this strangeness. And as I was thinking about this, I'm thinking I can't hear my voice. Why? And saying, "That's strange. Wonder why." And, I picked up Mike's rifle and I said to myself, "Remember, when you get these kind of, when you want to fire semi automatic, is what you want to do, right? Yes. You have to click it twice, the safety off. and I made sure to say where it was, and I did the clicks, and I did the, all these kind of strange things are happening, and you're questioning yourself. It's a curious situation. You've never been here before, but you're reacting. You're not thinking. You're just reacting, and it's automatic. It's an automatic pilot. There's no fear. There's no bravery. There's no courage. You're just simply moving and acting and talking. And I was talking to myself, at least internally, the whole time. And I remember as well, the first time I shot out my pistol, I pressed the button to get rid of the magazine, let it drop, and I said to myself, don't pick up that effing magazine. Remember what your instructor said. Don't pick up the magazine, just reload. You don't need that magazine anymore. Get out of there, just continue on. And that was very, that's kind of interesting, right? When you're in these situations, you're thinking about this and so forth. So I grabbed Mike's rifle and moved further. I started firing Mike's rifle at these guys who, again, it was so strange to me that these men would charge me with no weapons, still tied up. And they were charging me and trying to headbutt me. Very close quarters, obviously. So this happened for about 17 to 18 minutes down there in the southern compound. And very strange things were going on in the sense that I was firing my pistol. A guy was very close to me. He had a rifle, one of the al-Qaeda guys. He was shooting me with the rifle, or at me, and he was missing, and I'm missing him with my pistol. Very close range, 10 meters. It's just standing there. And I'm not a good marksman, right? I had my training and I was in the military, but obviously some of these people are falling when I shoot them and others aren't. A grenade hit me in the leg. It didn't go off.
Oh my gosh.
I remember hitting, in the right thigh. It just popped. And then I saw another grenade and it's twirling in the air and it has this smoke going out of it. Like it's been, what do you call it? Set. So one grenade hit me and obviously it didn't go off. Either it didn't work or the guy didn't know what he was doing. But the other grenade, it blew up over me, but I could see it going in front of my face. But anyway, I got out of that southern compound and got to the northern compound. And that's where I came back to earth, so to speak. I was no longer floating in slow motion and I regained my sense of hearing, and then I started shaking a little bit as I squatted down, and all these Afghans, these allies, were coming over to me asking me what's going on, what should we do? And I had this German and his film crew was doing the same things, like what are and like, who are you, number one, Mr. German guy? I don't know who you are. Why are you asking me questions about what we're supposed to do? Because by that time, it hit me. I don't want to say quickly, but as I moved around, I saw all these dead and wounded Afghan fighters, our guys. And I was like asking myself, how did this just effing happen? I mean, this only started a second ago. How are these guys all dead and wounded up here? And it was a very sort of startling and stark sort of situation that I couldn't really figure out what was going on. And then, worst of all was, I'm asking myself, is Mike dead? Did this really happen? I'm looking at Mike's rifle and I say, yeah, you got his effing rifle. You took it from Mike, these guys, and you shot those guys. And so I'm trying to think where I am, what I'm doing, and all this is happening. It was just a rough sort of, period of time. And as I gathered myself, I started moving about, got into a prone position, fired up Mike's magazine, asked the Afghan next to me, because these guys, the al-Qaeda guys, were coming out of the southern compound, making assaults on us in the northern compound. They had weapons and so forth. And as I ran out, I'm just shooting these men as they move towards me. And I ran out of ammunition. I asked the kid next to me, this Afghan kid, and he says, what ammunition? We don't have any ammunition. And I move around looking for ammunition. All these Afghan kids are coming up to me, wounded. What do we do now, Commander Dawood? They call me Dawood, David. I don't know who these people are. Never seen him before in my life.
Hmm.
And I'm just it's just a bad situation. And I'm just coming to grips with the fact that this place has been engulfed. There's dozens of dead and wounded friendlies around. Mike is dead. And then I get, I start asking, has anybody seen Mike? And of course, the answer is yes. Everybody sees Mike. Everybody knows where he is. Mike is, in fact, not killed. He's running around somewhere. It's just chaos. It's just Afghanistan. They don't know who Mike is. They may have seen somebody else or whatever, but I'm just being confused and inundated with all this conflicting information. And then I'm starting to become, worried and afraid because I notice I don't see any of the commanders I know. The intelligence chief, whom I did know very, very well, I finally found him. And as he was moving about in front of me, he was shot in the thigh, upper thigh. And we dragged him towards us. And then the blood is squirting, from his leg as his heart beats. And when I saw that, and when I ripped off and that blood sort of hit me in the eye almost, I just knew this guy was going to pass, right? He's not going to survive.
Oh,
and I tried to put this tourniquet. It was just a mess. And they dragged him off and he survived. But anyway, my point is, after this commander was taken out, I felt totally abandoned. I had these Germans and other guys running around asking me questions, trying to, what do we do? How do we get out of here? And I'm trying to figure out that myself, and have these Afghan young men, these fighters, asking me the same thing. And I'm just looking for somebody that I know, and I don't know anybody. And finally, I do get on the phone, I do get on radio, and we enter into communications. And then some airstrikes begin. A QRF, a quick reaction forces, comes, but they can't reach me. Hours go by, and the airstrikes hit. I'm thrown off my feet, I think 4 or 5 times, thinking the bombs have missed and sort of hit me. Of course, you're always thinking yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
But no, these bombs had hit right on target in the southern compound. I can just imagine what happened down there. But I'm thrown off my feet. And finally, I find a guy whom I know, and he's like dressed in his Sunday best. And I'm asking him, where have you come from? He said, oh, I was in the road. I just heard about this. I came down to see what's going on. I said, how the fuck you get here? He said, I climbed over the wall. I said, I need to get out of here. Can we go? He said, sure, just follow me. And I said, well, you go first, show the way. And he just, scrambles, does like a little low crawl, and he gets over the wall, and he's climbing the wall, and he waves his hand, and I just follow him. And then this train of, journalists come with me, and some Afghans. And we fall down the wall, roll down the wall, and it's sort of suddenly quiet. We're outside the fort. And then this mortar lands, a healthy distance away from me, but it explodes. And I'm just like, what the hell? And so we just all run en masse to the road, and I get my rifle. I have no more bullets anywhere. But I point the rifle at a vehicle that's coming, and the vehicle stops, and we get in and go back to get out of danger. So that's 25 November.
My God. It's hard for me to imagine all of that, David. I mean, you described it in this incredible detail, but it's really hard for me to get a sense of what that must have been like. Did everyone think that you were dead and for hours and hours after all of this began? I mean, no communication.
Yeah, the QRF came and went. I don't know exactly when, but they couldn't reach me. Right, we're in radio communication with Glenn. I was talking to Glenn. He wasn't on my team. He was on Team Bravo, a good friend of mine anyway, a good guy. He was a medic. But he got into communication with me, and they brought with them special boat servicemen from Great Britain. And these men were laying down just incredible amounts of fire, machine gun fire, that undoubtedly saved my life, because they mowed these al-Qaeda guys down as they were moving out of the southern compound towards where I was. We're we're a very ineffective fighting force now. We don't have ammunition, and these kids are not, half of them aren't fighting. They run away. They can't shoot to begin with, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm out of ammunition. But I see these guys over from a distance, and they said they're going to come and get me. But later they tell me they can't make it because the fire's too heavy from where they are. They'd have to be in the open, and they can't get to me. They just say, get out of there. And I do that. But in any case, Glenn is there talking to me and telling me, what's going on. And obviously that's a huge, psychological boost just to be in contact with someone.
Sure.
But he said, get out of there if you can. We can't make it to you. And he's, they called in the airstrikes and so forth. But still, these AQ guys were, fighting. I mean, they were very serious, dedicated fighters, and they had skills. They're doing, fire and maneuver. They were very good.
Yeah, it just sounds like you survived by the slimmest of margins. I mean, you did everything in your power, no question about it. But being out of ammunition and surrounded by guys who couldn't fight and wouldn't fight and that sort of thing,
It's getting dark. It's getting dark, and I become afraid now. I don't want to be here in the dark, right? It would be terrible to be there in the dark. And so, that was another motivating factor for me to get out of there.
Mm-hmm. How long did it take you to link back up with the team or friendly forces in general?
I only from the drive, about a 15-minute drive from the fort to our little headquarters.
Wow. 15 minutes. I have to imagine it felt like worlds apart, though.
I don't remember it at all.
Wow,
I don't remember it all. There's much about this whole episode that, lasted a few days because we come back each day afterwards in order to get Mike's body. And there's assaults made on to the area by our Afghan allies and us to get Mike's body. And finally, after a few days, Mike's body is retrieved. That was for me, the most difficult part was to come back there in the subsequent days and have I don't know what, it's not courage, because I was scared shitless. I was scared shitless each day I returned there. Every time a bullet whistle, I mean, these men are still fighting. These AQ guys are still fighting. They're bombed the hell out of them. The AC-130s hit them at night, these aircraft. And they're still fighting in an effective force, and the Afghans are still dying, getting shot. We're supposed to, with them, get Mike's body, make assaults. And the Afghans are doing most of the fighting. But I am just, every time a bullet whistles over my head, I'm just thinking, this is the end for me. I can't do this. Thank goodness for my teammates. They encouraged me, let's put it that way, to come every morning and to, do the fighting, or not do the fighting. I was no longer fighting. I was combat ineffective. Let's put it that way. But I knew where Mike's body was. I spoke the language. So I had this veneer of knowing what I was doing. I was still, running around talking and doing stuff, but I was doing a lot of low crawling. Everybody's running around and I'm low crawling. I'm just scared shitless. I'm shaking. And guys on the team were supportive, but, they said, where Mike's body is, how to speak the language, you know what's going on, that friend and foe, because it was hard to figure out who's friendly and, who's the bad guys.
Oh, I bet.
But anyway, we had a commander, one of the Afghan cavalryman commanders found Mike's body. He came up to me and said, is Mike wearing blue jeans? I said, yes. He says, I see him. And it was right where I had left him, so to speak. He was right there, and the Afghans picked him up and brought him out. And that was sort of the end of it for me, at least.
Wow. So the space was, the southern compound was still contested when you recovered his body. My God.
Yes. Even after Mike's body was retrieved, it took days. It took about a whole 7 days. It took, I think, 3 or 4 days to get Mike's body. You'd have to consult the book and Toby, for the exact timing. But, these men, these AQ guys were fighting to the death, literally.
Man. Yeah, I don't really know what to say, David. Honestly, I just cannot imagine the experience you went through. Do you think that it was, how do I put this? Was it good for you personally to return there and to recover Mike's body? Did that help with your
mindset? In
hindsight,
there's so much Yeah, in hindsight, there's so much that went wrong and went right. Personally, I'm just talking personally. The fact that I got Mike's rifle, it when I think about those moments, those minutes in that southern compound, it's hard for me to separate truth from, perception, right? And I did keep a little notebook of it wasn't a diary, but it was a little notebook. And that in the that night and the day that followed, I jotted stuff down, and I'm glad I did. But most importantly, I was fortunate enough, and it's only being fortunate. This is not because I'm some kind of great guy, or again, there was no courage or bravery involved in those, especially in those initial moments. I was on autopilot. Mike called my name, and I moved towards him. I'm so glad I did. And I took Mike's rifle from him, and he was, he was dead. I think about Mike every single day, and he's a shadow that follows me or is with me every day, and I just want, I still think about him and that day and doing what I did and wondering if I did the right thing. And I have to say that, if I didn't think I did, I couldn't probably live with myself. You know what I mean? That's what I guess these things are all about in the end for me. And I'm happy that that whatever moved me towards Mike allowed me to get Mike and see him, kick him, get his rifle, and get out of there, obviously. And and Mike, Mike left a family behind. He left his parents. His sacrifice is, it's symbolic, but it's real, right? And Mike was the epitome of that warrior CIA paramilitary officer, the epitome of a patriot and American,
Mm-hmm.
right? Who went over there, from faraway Alabama, not really knowing what was what, but knowing he had to go over there and be at the tip of the spear. And that's a motivating thing, and that's an inspirational thing. And I wish, you know, people would realize that we have people like that we have many, many people like that the agency's full of that. I'm sure the military's full of people like that. And America's full of people like that who are willing to sacrifice a great deal, everything for our country and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
We need people like Mike. And thank goodness we have them.
No question about it. David, I remember, late 2001, as a much younger man, of course, and without really any background or knowledge about any of this stuff. I do remember the stories about Mike coming out, and I think I read an article, maybe like in Newsweek or in Time, about him, and there was a photo of him on horseback carrying a rifle in Afghanistan, I think it was. And I haven't seen that photo in probably 20 years now, but instantly, instantly, just tremendous respect for that guy, and just thoughtfulness about what in the world, what are the qualities of a man that leads him into Afghanistan just weeks after this attack, right into the fray of it. And he certainly, he had the qualities that we would look for, I think, in the person that we would send. And I was just tremendously impressed by what I learned about him as a very young person who knew nothing else about that conflict yet or that area.
Yeah, I hope he's an inspiration for many others as well.
Yeah, he certainly left a lasting impact on a lot of people that never met him in person, never would have known about him otherwise, I think. But he made a tremendous impression on all of us.
Yeah.
So, what happened after the uprising was quelled? What was there left for you to do in Afghanistan? I mean, did you have to just get right back to moving toward Kabul,
Well, no,
or what?
after I accompanied Mike's body back to Tashkent,
Ah, okay.
and then from there he moved onwards, obviously, to Germany and then to the United States. I did not go after Tashkent. My family was in Tashkent, my wife and kids, so I stayed there. My career went on. I retired in 2020.
Mm.
So in those years, obviously, not a day went by that I didn't think about all this. But I had my kids and wife and things to do, right? And you can't let that stuff get you down. You have to go about you can't think about yourself. You can't be a victim, or at least that's the way I view it. I I had people depending on me, my wife and kids, and other people, and I obviously your life changes, but I didn't know anything different, right? That happened. You move on, and I had a great career. The agency's full of great people, men and women who I admire tremendously. I never, and being part of that company of people, that sustained me and allowed me, I always wanted to continue working. And when I was able to retire, I kept going for a few years
Hmm,
simply because of those people and what all that meant to me.
I see. I can understand that totally. But can you tell me a little about Badger 6? Because that was the first place
Oh
that I
yeah,
saw you in person, was at the
right.
event in New York last year.
Yeah, Badger 6 is a charity that we started in 2022 with Mike Spann's widow, Shannon Spann de Bruin. She and I and a couple other people started the charity that is designed to help the Afghan cavalry commanders and their families that helped us in 2001. These Afghans, there's 30 to 40 families. Well, there's about 40 families total that we're trying to help. Some are already in the United States. They were evacuated. Some are still in Afghanistan, neighboring countries. They're in bad shape. Some of them in hiding. These men are not SIVs. If you're familiar with all this verbiage about
Oh, yes.
getting here, we're so anyway. In any case, we have started up. It's badger6.org, and you can read our little stories there about what we're all about, what we're trying to do. We've been, we're making a difference. The group to a degree has gotten together again. Working with Shannon is tremendous. It sort of, brings things full circle. We were able to evacuate a couple of the men and their families that Mike worked with very, very closely. People who were under very serious threat. We got them out, and they're here in the United States. And there's other people that still need support overseas, and that's what we're trying to do. And it's a great process. It's, again, I think it's bringing this full circle. The
Hmm.
memory of Mike continues with us in what we do in our charity fundraising, and it brings a lot of great people together. I'm not just sitting here in my house anymore, retired, right? I'm going out and meeting people who have similar values and similar, ideas. And it's great to meet great Americans who are willing to just talk about this, hear about this, and support us in whatever ways possible.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I was so grateful that I was able to attend that one event and see the passion and the drive and the progress that had been made as well, and to actually meet at least one of the families I believe were there at the event as well, if
Yes,
not more than
yes,
one.
one of the
So
commanders. In fact, that commander who found Mike's body, who located Mike's body, lives in Philadelphia.
that was him. Oh wow, okay, I
Yes,
didn't realize that.
that's
Yeah.
one you met. Yeah, yes,
Okay, okay, fantastic. Yeah, I shook his hand and spoke to him briefly, but there was a language barrier there even now. But it's yeah, I mean, if anyone deserves to be supported after the fact, it's certainly him. And I'm glad that you're able to help out, and that I was able to help out and donate a little bit as well. So for those of you listening, if you're interested, you can learn a lot more at badger6.org. Like you said, I've donated in the past. I've run a fundraiser, and you're free to donate there as well. And it's very much a worthy cause, and as you can tell, it's very important to David and a lot of other people as well. David, I really appreciate your time. Do you anticipate that you'll be speaking or writing about this publicly in the future?
no, no, I do things. Justin, you've helped us out at Badger Six. It's incumbent upon me to try to help you out, and I thank you for your support. Yeah, I'm not really interested in doing a whole lot. I'll do a podcast for people and so forth, and we try to fundraise. So I get out a little bit doing that, but of course people are interested in the story. The story is a great story. Mike's story is a great story. So when I can be part of that kind of thing, I do like talking about that and perpetuating you know Mike, the memory of Mike and his legacy, and be part of that's very important. Yes.
I totally agree, and I'm really glad that I'm able to help share that story a little bit because even there are a lot of younger people, especially that are not aware of what happened in time that to us it was not that long ago, really. But for a lot of younger people, especially, they don't really understand the context of that time period and what all of that really meant. So I'm glad to help spread that awareness a little bit and help clear some things up for them. David, I really appreciate your time. I know I've kept you for a long time tonight, but thank you so much for this. It's been incredibly enlightening, and I really appreciate you opening up about all of this.
Thank you, Justin. Good luck to you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.